Hi. I had been thinking about the fact that being stuck indoors, we were probably going to have some issues in continuing on with things like the FLC and the book club. And I thought, well, I wanted to finish what I had started. And so I was really enjoying reading the book How Humans Learn by Josuha Eyler. And while somebody was joking around that I strategically chose the chapter on authenticity because it was the shortest chapter in the book, I honestly did not know it was going to be the shortest chapter in the book. I chose it just because of the title. It caught my eye, and I thought this was going to be something interesting to look at. I think I'm sensitive to the word authenticity and to what it means because in the classroom, I try to be true to myself and expose myself or be transparent with my students. Doesn't always work well. I can't say that every decision I've made or every strategy I've chose to use has been successful and worked out well. But again, I always try to come back to that, being myself. But I know that authenticity in teaching and learning is a lot broader of a concept, and so I really wanted to spend some time kind of digging around in this chapter. I guess first what I'll do is I'll kind of go through and talk a little bit about the chapter itself. I thought it was interesting, the example of using forensic anthropology was pretty effective and interesting to me because I had taken a lot of anthropology classes when I was an undergraduate student myself. And so the example of Professor Donna Boyd at Radford University and her use of a real skeleton in class to kind of walk through and get familiar with the bones in the body and where things are located, and then being able to kind of use that to sort of, I guess, hypothesize how this person, develop a theory of how this person came to be where they were found. And so there were the key questions that she brought up for her classes. What could we learn about a person from this bone? What information do you need first in order to develop a hypothesis? And then what could possibly explain the fact that the broken bones are all in different locations? And so in seeking to answer each of those questions and kind of thinking through, looking at individual bones and then the skeleton as a whole, the class is able to then come up with a plausible hypothesis about how did this happen, what happened to this person. The key takeaway for me was the statement, we learn things much better when they're real. And that's true. I have to say I enjoy being in the classroom, otherwise I wouldn't be teaching and I would not have spent as much time as I did in school. But I've also enjoyed my time working. I feel like I've learned a lot on the job over the last, my 25 years in practice and then the last 10 years working in higher education. So I see the value of being real, being feet on the ground or in the trenches, so to speak. I think that's really important. So that is really the heart of authentic learning, is being real. So how does Eyler choose to define authenticity? Well, it's a learning experience having as much fidelity as possible to what students will encounter outside of school in terms of tools, complexity, cognitive functioning, and interactions with people. Therefore, creating an authentic learning context requires more than just presenting students with realistic problems or situations. It also means that students must address the problems or situations realistically as well. By example, one of my first experiences with this form of teaching and learning was when I was a student at the University of Central Florida and I was taking my accounting information systems course. We had to work on a project, and the project took us outside the classroom. We had to connect with a real organization, identify a potential project that we could apply this technology we were learning to help them solve a problem or address an issue. And then we had to present this to the class at the end of the semester and show how our particular solution worked and explain, basically what we learned in going through the exercise. So I guess that was really my first exposure to kind of experiential type learning. So again, the key link is between realism and authenticity. The fact that we were talking to real people with real business problems and trying to identify how we would take what we were learning in our books and in the classroom to being able to come up with a solution that would be viewed as something that made sense to people who were actually in the real work environment. I decided to just take a look at the actual formal definition for authenticity. And so one of them was worthy of acceptance or belief as conforming to or based on fact. We've all heard a lot about facts lately. Confirming to an original so as to reproduce essential features. And made or done the same way as an original. I think that's interesting. It's kind of the idea, I guess, of copying. Not false or an imitation. It's real or actual. So I guess I'm a real Mayo person as opposed to Miracle Whip. And I like the full version of mayonnaise instead of some of these others that they've come up with, the olive oil and some of the other variations. And I also like real peanut butter over peanut butter spreads and so forth. So I like the real, not the imitations. So how does authenticity apply to learning? It's simulating something real, so real the brain thinks it's genuine, that they really believe that they're in that situation having to make that decision. And actually, when you think about it, that's not easy. That's not easy to simulate in certain classroom environments. I mean, in nursing, I've seen it where they can do a pretty good job of simulating that environment. The medical field seems to be real advanced in terms of the ability to do that. Business, I think we're working on it, and I think we're coming up for some ways of us being able to do that through, and I'll go over some of the ways that we do that later. But I'm kind of curious as to how other fields are handling it, such as those in the arts and sciences. And then Eyler employs the example of a flight simulator to make the point, and this one really caught me because I had spent time working at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, and of course, they have one of the largest fleets of private planes in the United States, and so students do learn by actually flying a real plane, but it's dangerous. So they spend a lot of time in flight simulators where they make mistakes just like they would in a real plane, and they can crash the simulator, but the issue is they don't do any damage, and they don't hurt themselves or others, they don't kill themselves or others. And unfortunately, during my time there, and as I've kept track of the schools since I left, there have been a number of accidents where students and flight instructors have been injured or killed in air accidents that occurred during training flights. So the idea is to put them in the simulator and give them as much time in the simulator as possible so that by the time they actually sit in a real cockpit and are flying a real plane, they've already done it before. And they can put them into a lot of different situations and teach them how to handle those situations before they actually encounter them in real flight. So learning is deeper if accomplished in an authentic domain-specific context. I guess I would agree with that. I mean, I learn a lot sitting in the classroom and learning under somebody who is able to share information with me, but it does help when that person has really experienced it. When I took anthropology classes, I'll go back to the anthropology example. One of the things I really appreciated about the faculty who were teaching anthropology was the fact that they spent time working in the field. They would from time to time go back out and work on a real project and be out in the field, boots on the ground, hands in the dirt, interacting with people, studying cultures, and then bringing it back to the classroom. I felt that that was a pretty important part of education. I took an African Politics of Africa course that was taught by somebody who was from Africa that had spent time as a political prisoner in South Africa, and so I found that to be particularly insightful and interesting and engaging, because that person was able to make it as real as he could in the classroom for us in describing his experiences. And again, the power is in the ability to provide that kind of rich descriptive context so that we can imagine being in that situation. So I think that there's other ways in actually putting a person in the situation. It's kind of like watching a movie or reading a book. The skill of the director and the editors and the actors, or the skill of the author in terms of creating that kind of environment where you feel sucked in, drawn in, where you feel like you're actually there. I read Michael Connelly books, the Harry Bosch series and the Lincoln Lawyer. I kind of feel like he's very effective. When I'm reading those books, I actually feel like I'm there. I'm sitting in the room. I can visualize it. I actually feel like I know some of these characters. I mean, heck, I've told my wife I oftentimes feel like I'm friends with Harry Bosch. So it seems kind of silly, but hey, that's what it is. So what matters is whether the learner believes they're in a real situation, dealing with real problems, seeking real solutions. And so, like for me, in reading the Harry Bosch novels, I really do feel like I'm in that situation, following him along and trying to figure out these crimes that he's trying to solve. So, imperfect example maybe, but I think it gets the point across. And so how do we accomplish this in the classroom, though? Let's take a look at a few things. There's this idea of cognitive authenticity. So in teaching and learning, we must create activities that put students in situations that appear real to them. That's one thing. Situated cognition, which is heavily dependent on context and environment. So again, the idea, I think that's why in training classes, they often do the role-playing exercises where, when we were auditors, we used to train to do interviews by actually sitting and doing interviews with other auditors. And we would do them in front of kind of a live training audience. And we would volunteer and take turns to do that. It seems silly to me. I was uncomfortable, but if you can put aside the fact that you were playing a role, it is kind of an effective way to train. They do that at FLC, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. They actually hire people to be actors who will be the people who are going to be questioned, and then the agents who are in training will come in and question them. And these aren't professional actors. They're people with some acting skills, people that have gone through some training. And they do a really good job of playing the part of the bad guy so that the agent in training actually feels like they're in an interrogation room interrogating a real suspect. So I think that's kind of interesting. And then again, students must be immersed in the context or the environment. When I was in firefighting, I remember the training that we had to go through, and we sometimes would go to a training center, and in the training center they had different scenarios, and we fought real fires in real structures. We had train cars set up that could be set up. We had cars and trucks and all types of different things. We had commercial buildings, high-rise buildings, houses, and these structures could be set up to have different scenarios where we would go in and then put out the fire. So it was controlled, but there was a certain amount of danger in it, in that we were fighting a real fire, but it wasn't a controlled environment. An immersion, placing the students into an environment or context in which they believe it is real or could be real. Again, the recurring theme here is the idea that the student is being placed in a situation where they feel that what they're working with is real. And so again, this comes back to simulation. So create a context, immerse a student, student believes accordingly. And I'm going to talk about how I use the simulations in just a little bit. So how do we incorporate experiential learning in business? There's the service learning, and Eyler talks about service learning in the chapter quite a bit. We use a lot of internships in business where we can put students with employers. We're beginning to develop job shadowing. I know Dean Connors is working on trying to find opportunities for students to job shadow. I'm using simulations. I know other people use simulations. Kevin, I know, has talked about a simulation that he learned that he uses. Case studies. I use case studies in my auditing class. I'm sure that others use them as well. I know I've heard it from students. And then bringing practitioners into the classroom, we find a lot of different ways to incorporate guest speakers, presentations, visits to facilities, and also in the strategic management class, they use actual practitioners to come in and help evaluate the student presentations and give them pointers. And then we have the incubator downtown Dalton, where they're actually working and helping people with real businesses. And connecting experience with learning through different assignments, they need to incorporate a certain amount of reflection. Students need to be able to look back at what they've been doing and be able to connect it to what they've been learning. So that this way, it's important not to leave out the learning portion of this. So that's where the reflection comes in. You might be asking them to keep journals or write a paper or give some form of presentation, or any combination of those items. I think makes it more real. And Eyler, of course, is critical of lectures. I know that in my third year review, some people had made comments about the fact that it seemed like I was lecturing a lot. In accounting, it's hard to get away from that, but I am trying to do a few things, and I'll talk about that. He considers it an inauthentic style, that it promotes kind of this passive engagement where you're sitting, listening, and note-taking. And he acknowledges it remains a dominant pedagogical style, and I think that's because that's the way we've been trained. That was the example that was set for us. But I think more and more, with the whole Centers for Teaching and Learning and the faculty mentoring that goes on, and then the new faculty process that's being put in place, more and more we're being exposed to other types of pedagogical practices that get away from just the traditional lecture style. So what am I doing? Well, personal application and reflection here. I'm trying to vary my pedagogical style. I'm using increased numbers of simulations and cases in my classes. For instance, in auditing, the entire second half of the semester is really just a series of simulations and cases that I assign to the students. They work on them in groups, and then I question them in groups. I ask them to share their collective responses to me in that group setting, and we kind of share what we've all learned. And we see the diversity of thought, the different approaches that people took to handle the situation or the problem. It's not perfect. It doesn't perfectly put them into the real situation, but it provides more context than just me telling them what to do. I do shorter lecture periods, and then I kind of break them up by using questions of the students. Then I also use a lot of in-class examples to break up those lectures, so that if I finish discussing, say, a particular method for accounting for inventory, I give them a problem that we work through together, and before we move on to the next. So this way they're getting something, it's being reinforced with a problem. And I do try to explain to them some of the variations or some of the differences between what we see in the classroom and then what you'll actually see when you're out in the field, because I think that's kind of important. Again, demonstrating application after explaining the concepts and methods I think is really important. And then I do try to share my own personal professional experiences with them when it's relevant. So if it ties into something that we're learning, something we're doing, I think that's important, and I really try to utilize those and draw on those, and I try to continue to build new experiences for myself so that I can continue to have something to share and be relevant, rather than relying on the same stories over and over again. So again, that kind of summarizes what I pulled out of the authenticity chapter. I liked this little picture here, kind of the rubber ducky and the little chick there, you know. So we've got the authentic one and we've got the inauthentic one. The inauthentic one is not bad. It's, you know, everybody, I don't know if anybody had a rubber ducky when they were a kid that they used to play with in the tub. I know I had my rubber duckies. And then also enjoyed being around little chicks, because I had friends who had real animals, and that was always fun to be around and to interact, and you could learn a lot. And so each one has its place, but I don't think there's any real replacement for the authentic, the real thing. So at any rate, hopefully this has been kind of effective. I'm going to share this with everyone in the group, and maybe we can have an online discussion at some point in time. Thanks very much, and I hope I did an okay job.